Having systematically stripped Americans of our rights on everything from unwarranted spying to habeas corpus, our third story in the countdown, the president now trying to take away perhaps the most American right of all, the right to sue somebody. His agencies are pushing new regulations, declaring that federal rules on specific issues overrule your right to sue about those issues in state courts. With a little over 1 month remaining in this administration, the American Association for Justice, a group representing America's trial lawyers, has identified about a dozen rules that have been published for public comment, but which Mr. Bush has not yet pushed through. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding may want to check out page 30,831 of this year's Federal Register, which proposes new rules for drug warnings that apply to women in your condition, but would also preempt state laws giving Americans the right to ask a jury to hold drug companies responsible for their labeling. It's not just the rights of women that could be in jeopardy. There's similar language in proposed FDA regulations on labels for over-the-counter drugs, over-the-counter analgesics, calcium pills, and sunscreen. And then there's the proposed regulations from the National Highway and Transportation Safety Administration, which include preemptive language embedded in rules on everything from rear view mirrors to brake hoses to windshield intrusion to motorcycle brakes to motorcycle helmets. Then there are the rules like the one on seat belts for small school buses, which means if you were injured in a large school bus without seat belts, you likely could not sue about it. Or the rule on the ability of your car roof to keep you or keep from crushing you in a rollover crash, which included language giving automakers complete immunity from all lawsuits about what you're seeing there. Or the rules on electric hybrids, a proposition that the AAJ says is so broad it could preempt your right to sue for just about anything, even if you ended up with an electric hybrid Pinto. And if it seems safest to preserve your right to sue by just staying away from drugstores and off the roads to essentially remain isolated in your home, consider this. Under a new transportation rule, if a train carrying hazardous materials crashes near your home, you would have no recourse to ask for damages in state court. Joining us now is Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation magazine, who I'm interviewing on the undertaking that he will not sue me. Thanks for your time tonight, Chris.
Thank you, Keith.
So this is what? An attempt to restore the American corporation to the full and untouchable status it had circa 1889?
Yeah, well, this is part of a very long trend of the conservative movement in America. It's sort of a pincer movement. On one hand, what they want to do is get rid of regulation, and on the other hand, they want to get rid of your right to sue. The point being that you need to have one or the other in order to keep corporate power in check. Either you have a strong regulatory state that oversees what happens in the corporate sector, like they do in Europe, which is much less litigious society but much more heavily regulated, or you have the U.S. version in which we essentially outsource our regulatory apparatus to trial lawyers and to private citizens who bring claims against, cars that malfunction and devices, etc. What they're trying to do is get rid of both, essentially creating this sort of broad immunity for corporate malfeasance. And
the methodology of achieving both. It's a sort of subterfuge that sounds like the signing statements that Mr. Bush so popularized, just sort of a way for this administration to essentially change the laws and change the regulations unilaterally, and then that begs the same question that goes on with the signing statement. So how is this even remotely legal?
Well, it is legal, and in fact, there's some continuity here. I mean, the modern trend of what they call midnight regulatory changes or midnight rule changes started in the Carter administration. They promulgated about 30,000 pages worth of rules. It was continued in the Clinton administration through Reagan. So there's actually more continuity in this area than there were on things like signing statements. The reason it's legal is because George W. Bush remains the head of the federal bureaucracy, and the federal bureaucracy, essentially sets the interpretive frameworks and interpretive rule structure for its own mechanism. And so he retains that power until the day he leaves office.
And Congress, because of the Congressional Review Act of 1996, has this right to reverse anything passed in the last 60 days of an outgoing administration. Are they going to use it?
It's a really good question. The irony, of course, is that act was passed in '96 by the Gingrich Congress as a way of sort of preemptive retaliation against whatever Bill Clinton might do in the last days of his presidency. But since the act has been passed, there's never been a transfer of power in which the president and both houses were of the same party. And so essentially the act was gutted because of veto power or divided government. So this is going to be the first time the act is in effect when we have this kind of transfer. And I would really not be surprised if on some of the most egregious issues, we do see Congress use the act.
But what about the older stuff? I mean, as you said, the administration has been doing this for a while. There are dozens of similar regulations favoring the corporation over those evil consumers. What is the process of undoing that? How long will that take?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, we have one story in the Washington Post talking about legal advisors, a team of up to 40 advisors that are going through all the executive orders. And it really is important to stress the fact that from day one they've been doing these sorts of things. I mean, this was even admitted to. I think it was the head of HHS or Interior who basically said, you know, I resent the fact that people say this is last minute. We've basically been doing this for the entire administration. So it's going to take a broad, kind of comprehensive legal strategy on the part of the incoming administration to figure out what they want to prioritize and what they can go after.
We didn't steal these ashtrays on the way out. We've been stowing them away for years. Chris Hayes of The Nation, as always. Great thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Keith.